All right, so part two of the lecture for week 4. We will start with the era of good feelings and go into nationalism and expansion. And within this, we will discuss the American system as created by Henry Clay. So, now what was the era of good feelings? This was a time after the War of 1812 when we see a new sense of nationalist fervor, which we'll get to that in a minute, when there was great pride and confidence in the American experiment. It was also a time when essentially one party dominated, and that would be the Democratic Republicans. It would end as quickly as it emerged with the Panic of 1819, the Missouri Compromise, increasing competition among regions, which again we will discuss shortly. But the era began with the end of the war, and the previously criticized James Madison came to the forefront and was insanely popular after leading the nation through the war. The excess junto has all but wiped out the Federalists, leaving Democratic Republicans with essential free reign, thus the era of good feelings. Madison took advantage of this to implement an aggressive domestic policy. We discussed this previously, but he had urged states to finance transportation systems and other internal improvements, something Henry Clay would call the American system. The goal was to create a national market economy. Local market economies had sprung up around centers in the Northeast, improving trade but also leading to increased specialization. Thus, a farmer may grow one or two main crops, sell them at market, and use the profits to purchase the other items he needed. Clay and the others wanted to see an expansion of this to a larger scale of interdependence, with entire regions specializing in certain commodities for which the geography, climate, and temperament of the people were most suitable. For example, agricultural regions in the West would produce food for the industrialized Northeast and the fiber-producing South. The North would depend on the South for efficiently produced cotton, and both South and West would depend on the Northeast for manufactured goods. This, many hoped, would free the nation from economic dependence on Europe and find economic independence. It also demonstrated the need for these regions to work together, showing the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. This required national banking, and in 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered. Congress provided $7 of its $35 million in opening capital and appointed 1/5 of the board of directors. Republicans in Congress also put forth a series of proposals which created improvements in transportation and communication, announcing they would, quote, bind the republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. From this, we get the Cumberland Road, the Erie Canal, etc., etc. Third and last, they advocated protective tariffs to help new industries. This was great for manufacturers in New England. After all, a return to free trade after the war only allowed Britain to swoop in with cheaper cotton and woolen cloth. Southerners, though, questioned the impact of such a tariff and what it would do to their costs. Now, this is antithetical to the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, right? To his Republican ideals. No more emphasis on the independent yeoman farmer, but now interdependence between industries and tariffs and protectionism. Those are absolutely antithetical to the idea of free market capitalism. But again, this was a way that the nation was trying to cobble together its American system. Now, this type of system would truly reflect a unified nation. It would emphasize regional differences for the overall strength of the nation. It incorporated both regionalism and nationalism. And again, it made the nation or the whole greater than the sum of its parts. But again, let's focus here on nationalism because this is key. What is nationalism? You might want to ask yourself that. Maybe it's the pride in one's nation. Maybe it's the focus on one's nation above other nations. Today it has a negative connotation, unfortunately, but it has not always had this. Now, building off the War of 1812, a war which we fought against the British, this was not really a resounding victory, but we held our own. And this helps to usher in a new sense of nationalism, a new form of national pride. Because prior to this, remember, we had won the revolution. We had not stood very well on our own just yet. We had many issues domestically and internationally. Britain did not respect us, and that's what led to the War of 1812. They essentially still considered us one of their colonies. And so when we held our own and we made it through that war still as an independent nation, that was a victory of sorts. Again, the fighting itself, it was not a victory, but the overall impact was quite important to the young republic. Again, it fosters this new sense of national pride, new nationalism, a sense that we can hang with the big boys, so to speak. We did, we survived. And again, so we come out of that feeling pretty good about ourselves. Nationalism's roots now can be found in Europe and was developing at quite a pace there before and during this time. Napoleon's reign provides one example. Nationalism is often attributed to the French Revolution and Napoleon. First, why? I'm going to go into this. The French Revolution threw off the shackles of the crown. In the past, people were loyal to a king, to a queen, to the royalty, to the leadership of a country. But during this time, after our revolution, early in the 19th century, this would change. Again, similar to the American Revolution, the French Revolution garnered independence from the crown, throwing off the controls of an unjust king. Now, the French people were loyal to the state of France, not to Louis XVI or any other king. They were loyal to the state. Prior to this time, there was certainly pride associated with one's nation, but this is when that truly turns a corner and becomes a dominant theme in the West. This, of course, would play a huge role in the revolutions of 1848, in the unification of Italy, and the unification of Germany, and then, of course, leading into the major wars in the 20th century. But at this time, again, this is one of the major differences that we see and what nationalism really means. Because again, you are now showing loyalty to the state, not to a person, not to the crown, not to a position. So this is, again, a revolutionary change. Getting back to Napoleon, he and his actions would only build upon this, both in negative and positive fashion. As Napoleon conquered Western Europe, the French people became more aware of the country's expansion, and it fills them with pride. Napoleon is the French leader. He is taking the country and the empire to new heights, and the French people are in general happy about this. Maybe not so much about the repression at home, but that is not for this class or this topic. On the other hand, those who had been conquered by Napoleon, they too are developing nationalist sentiments, primarily as a defense against this encroachment on their sovereignty. Nationalism provides a new type of togetherness, a new type of unity among these nations, and this spreads during this time. Nationalism was a dominant theme throughout the 19th century. Again, this would be key to the revolutions of 1848, to Germany and to Italy, because again, both of these states, we think of them in this massive throughout history, but the current nation states of Germany and Italy were actually formed in the latter part of the 19th century. So this nationalism again takes over Europe, dominates Europe, and it would come to the New World as well. One could certainly argue it began to develop around the time of the revolution, even prior to that, but for the most part we see this after the War of 1812 and the recognition that we were a legitimate nation with a real military for defense and could participate in international affairs on an equal footing. So now you can tell why this is necessary. If we're going to have a nation that is interdependent economically, then they're going to have some faith in the country as it is. And this is what we begin to see, and this is what helps to cobble together this American system. So let's get into expansion a little bit. In 1793, a text on American geography taught that the U.S. was composed of 3 basic divisions. Again, this is 1793, during Washington's presidency, right after the Republic had started. The 3 basic divisions, northern, middle, and southern, each along the eastern seaboard. By 1819, the same text added a region for the western states and territories. By 1821, 11 new states had been added to the Union from the original 13 colonies. The Louisiana Purchase, military intervention in Spanish Florida, and later the Mexican-American War would really expand us into the West. Now, Florida is noteworthy for a few reasons. Pirates and renegades had used Florida as a base for launching raids against American settlements and shipping. Additionally, runaway slaves found it a safe haven in their flight from southern plantations. So what does America do about this? December of 1817, General Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, wrote the president advocating the invasion of Spanish Florida. A short time later, Secretary of War John Calhoun ordered Jackson to lead a military expedition into southern Georgia, but Jackson crossed the border and forced the Spanish government to flee. So he goes again into Florida there. These were not his instructions, but Secretary of State John Quincy Adams declared that this raid was an act of self-defense and that it would be repeated if the Spanish could not police the area adequately. He realized that Spain could not protect American interests, and Spanish Spanish minister Don Luis de Onís chose to cede Florida in the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819. The United States got all of Florida in exchange for releasing Spain from $5 million in damage claims resulting from these border raids. But this was part of a larger issue as well. Spain was unable to peacefully and efficiently maintain their colonial enterprises in the Western Hemisphere, which led to independence movements in Latin America and the establishment of new republics there. Some of the old guard European powers wanted to help preserve Spanish authority in the Americas, but neither the U.S. nor Britain viewed that as a positive. They did not want recolonization to occur. The British sought an alliance of sorts to prevent European meddling. Monroe refused, stating that America would be reduced to, quote, a cockboat in the wake of the British man of war. The British Navy, of course, dominates the seas at this time. And Monroe feels that if we are to get into such an agreement, such an alliance with Britain, we will be the little brother and we will not be treated equally. So Monroe declares, quote, the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subject for future colonization by any European power. Later adding that end quote there, later adding that any effort by European countries, quote, to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and our safety. In other words, the Western Hemisphere is off limits to European powers as subjects of further colonization, and any attempt to do so would be viewed as a virtual act of war against the United States. What was this called? Of course, this was called the Monroe Doctrine. Think of this in the larger context. Only a decade before, we were embroiled in a losing military effort with little international respect, failing in ways which led an important region to consider seceding. But here we are in 1823 telling European nations to stay out of our hemisphere or face war. Pretty major difference. All right, we'll leave that. That's the end of week 4's video lectures. We'll see you next week. And next week we will get into nullification.